February is Black History Month, and in celebration of that, this week's book bite is from Hidden Figures, which is the true story of four African American women who helped to launch the United States into space. They worked for, at the time, it was NACA, which became NASA. Um, so they were instrumental in helping the U.S. aeronautics industry and helping to launch the first spacecraft into space from the US. You may have seen the movie, and this is the middle school version of the book that the movie was based on. Dorothy Vaughan, Mary Jackson, Katherine Johnson, and Christine Darden loved math. As children, they showed special skills in arithmetic, and they went on to study mathematics in college. After graduation, they worked as teachers before going to work as computers or mathematicians for the government's Air and Space program. Over the years, hundreds of women worked as mathematicians for the federal agency called the NACA, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, which researched and promoted the study of flight. But these women were among many who distinguished themselves with their talents and hard work. Dorothy Vaughan was a pioneer. She joined the NACA in 1943, the first year the agency began hiring African American women as computers, and she was the first to be promoted into a management position. She was a role model for other women, and she helped to steer the careers of many talented women who were joining the NACA. Mary Jackson was the first African American woman to move up the ranks and become an engineer at the NACA. She was a fighter, standing up for herself and for other women who deserved the chance to prove themselves. Her work helped to make supersonic aircraft fly higher and faster. Katherine Johnson was an African American woman who became an essential member of the team that put the first American into orbit around Earth. She was a dreamer and an independent thinker who was unafraid to imagine what others considered to be impossible. She helped do the math that was required to send the first men into space and to bring them home safely. Christine Darden was an African American woman who became one of the world's leading experts on supersonic flight. She became the face of the next generation of female space scientists. Her groundbreaking research on predicting sonic booms is still used today. The accomplishments of these four women were remarkable, but their work was even more impressive because it was achieved while living and working in the South during a time when racial discrimination was commonplace and when most women with an interest in math were expected to become math teachers. In the 1800s, after the Civil War, the government passed laws that ended slavery and granted full citizenship and voting rights to African Americans. Later, however, many state and local governments passed other laws that legalized racial segregation. These regulations, which were most common in the South, kept Black people and white people apart in many situations. They could not eat in the same restaurants. They could not drink from the same water fountains. They could not use the same restrooms. They could not attend the same schools. They could not ride in the same parts of the buses. They could not live in the same neighborhoods. They could not receive care in the same hospitals. They could not visit the same beaches. They could not compete on the same sports teams. They could not sit in the same section in movie theaters. They could not marry someone of a different race. They could not even be buried in the same cemeteries. Technically, African Americans had the right to vote. However, many local laws made it impossible for them to do so. Some communities levied or charged poll taxes, or enforced literacy requirements, or imposed other restrictions that made it difficult or impossible for Black people to register and vote. And since people who were not registered to vote weren't allowed to serve on juries or run for political office, many African Americans were deprived of these civil rights as well. During the 1930s, the United States experienced the Great Depression, a decade-long period of economic struggle. Jobs became difficult to find, and wages decreased dramatically. All Americans suffered, but African Americans faced the most serious challenges in finding work. For many African Americans, World War II was an opportunity to make a better life for themselves and their families. Black men enlisted in the military in large numbers. Even though they served in separate black infantry regiments, usually overseen by white officers, they believed that their loyalty and patriotism would help blacks to earn rights that white citizens had. Women also enlisted in the Army, where they were called WACs for Women's Army Corps, and they served in all female units in the Navy too. And for women like Dorothy Vaughan, Mary Jackson, Katherine Johnson, and Christine Darden, World War II opened the door to a career as a professional mathematician. Each of them found their way to the Langley Laboratory, where they met one another and women like them, smart, brave, confident, and good at math. The war was changing the world, and it would change their lives as well. The newspaper ad caught the attention of many women. It read, "Reduce your household duties. Women who are not afraid to roll up their sleeves and do jobs previously filled by men should call the Langley Memorial Aeronautical Laboratory." A few years earlier, an ad like this would have been unthinkable. Most employees never would have considered a woman for a job that had always been performed by a man. But in the spring of 1943, with World War II in full swing and many men off serving in the military, the country needed all the help it could get. Employers were beginning to hire women to do jobs that had once belonged to only men. This particular ad was placed by the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, or NACA, a government agency dedicated to studying the science of flying. The NACA shared a campus with the U.S. Army Corps in Hampton, Virginia, a city in the southeastern part of the state next to the Chesapeake Bay. The NACA's mission was important and unique: to help the United States develop the most powerful and efficient airplanes in the world. Airplanes moved military troops, tracked enemies, and launched bombs. World leaders felt that the country that ruled the skies would win the war. President Franklin D. Roosevelt believed in the importance of air power, so 2 years earlier, in 1941, he had challenged the nation to increase its production of airplanes to 50,000 units a year. At that time, the industry had manufactured only 3,000 planes a year. The NACA and private industry were up for the challenge. By 1943, the American aircraft industry was the largest, most productive, and most sophisticated in the world, making 3 times more planes than the Germans, who were fighting on the other side of the war. Before manufacturers built the airplanes, the designs were developed, tested, and refined at the Langley Memorial Aeronautical Laboratory, which was where the NACA had first begun its operations in 1917. The engineers created wind tunnels to simulate or imitate different conditions a plane could encounter when flying. This helped the engineers to test airplane parts as well as whole aircraft, examining them for any problems like air disturbance and uneven wing geometry. After that testing, pilots flew the planes, trying to assess how the machines handled in the air. Did the aircraft roll unexpectedly? Did it stall? Was it hard to guide or maneuver? Making small changes to the design added up to a difference in performance. Even tiny improvements in speed and efficiency multiplied over millions of pilot miles added a difference that would tip the balance of the war. People working at Langley knew that they were doing their part to win the war. "Victory through air power," said Henry Reed, the engineer in charge of the Langley Laboratory, and the workers took their mission to heart. Each of the engineers at the Langley Memorial Aeronautical Laboratory required the support of a number of other workers: craftsmen to build the airplane models, mechanics to maintain the test tunnels, and number crunchers to process the data that was collected during the tests. For the engineers, a plane was basically a complex physics experiment. Physics is the science of matter, energy, and motion. Physics meant math, and math meant mathematicians. At the Langley Laboratory, mathematicians meant women. Female mathematicians had been on the job at Langley since 1935, and it didn't take long for the women to show that they were just as good or even better at computing than many of the male engineers. But few of the women were granted the title mathematician, which would have put them on equal footing with some male employees. Instead, they were classified as sub-professionals, a title that meant they could be paid less. At Langley, the female mathematicians were called computers, They did the computations to turn the results of the raw data gathered by the engineers into a more useful form. Today, we think of computers as machines, but in the 1940s, a computer was just someone whose job it was to do computations, a flesh and blood woman who was very good with numbers. In 1943, it was difficult for the Langley Laboratory to find as many qualified women as they needed. A recruiter from the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics visited colleges in search of young women with analytical or mathematical skills. When the managers couldn't satisfy the demand with only white employees, the government decided to hire African Americans. A civil rights leader named A. Philip Randolph encouraged President Roosevelt to sign an executive order, a law that ordered the desegregation of the federal government and defense industry and created the Fair Employment Practices Committee. This executive order opened up new and exciting opportunities for African Americans, allowing them to work side by side with white people during the war. The federal government also helped create special training classes at Black colleges where people could learn the skill that they need to be successful in the war jobs. Black newspapers like the Norfolk Journal and Guide published articles telling their readers to apply for these new job openings, and there were many applicants. The applications were not supposed to consider race. A recent law had done away with the requirement that the application must include a photo, but it wasn't hard for employees to figure out which job candidates were Black. African Americans did not have access to white colleges and universities, so Black applicants came from Black colleges, such as West Virginia State University, Howard University, Hampton Institute, and Arkansas Agricultural, Mechanical, and Normal College. Many of the African American candidates had years of teaching experience as well as math and science degrees. Once hired, the Black mathematicians were assigned to a separate workspace in the warehouse building on the west side of the Langley campus. The East area computers were all white. The West area computers were all Black, except for the supervisor and her assistant, who were white women. There had always been African American employees at Langley, but they had worked as janitors, cafeteria workers, mechanics assistants, and groundskeepers. Hiring Black mathematicians, that was something new. For the most part, the engineers welcomed extra hands, and if those hands were Black, even if those hands were Black, the Langley Laboratory was operating around the clock to test airplanes to be flown by American soldiers in the war. Everyone had a job to do. Hampton, Virginia, where the Langley campus was located, was very much a Southern town. State law and Virginia custom meant that African Americans did not ride the same buses or eat in the same cafeteria or use the same bathrooms as whites. The Langley staff had to prepare for the arrival of the African American mathematicians. One of the tasks, creating metal bathroom signs that read "Colored Girls." But for the Black women, the experience of working at a laboratory offered the chance to do interesting work that would help support the war effort. Walking into an unfamiliar environment wasn't easy for the women of the new West Area Computing Office, but each of them was eager for the opportunity to help their country and prove that they too could be excellent mathematicians. And again, that is the beginning of Hidden Figures. And you can request that from the Book Dash, and I will deliver it to you. You can find that Book Dash form in the Library Schoology course.